Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased that I have been joined here in the Federation Chamber by the member for O'Connor. The reason I'm pleased about that is because he understands farmers. He understands agriculture. He represents an electorate, as large as it is, that on an average year produces 10 million tonnes of wheat. 10 million tonnes of wheat a year. And I know the Grain Producers Chief Executive Officer, Colin Beddles, is also in the chairs behind me, and I acknowledge his presence. And both the member for O'Connor and Mr Beddles were in Parliament earlier this week to celebrate all that is good about grain production, all that is good about farmers, all that is good about agriculture. And I note too, on the Speaker's list, and I'm not using it as a prop, so I'll give it back, is that the list is dominated by coalition speakers, appreciating that the member for Ryan from the Greens just spoke. But this list is heavy with coalition members addressing this very important matter. Every member of this House should be speaking on this bill because it is that important. We are, as Labor has finally been caught kicking and screaming, dragging to the table, Labor has finally admitted that we are in a cost of living crisis. A crisis, I would argue, that has been brought about under its watch because of its policies. And yet here we are talking about slugging our farmers, our hard-working cockies, the best in the world. Make no mistake, with a, Labor calls it a levy, I'll call it what it is, it's a tax on them to do what? To pay for the biosecurity of their competitors' products coming in from overseas and going on the same shelves as their own products. What other nation in the world would do something like this? What other country would be so goddamn stupid as to slug its farmers who, by the very work and sweat, produce the world's finest food, and slug them for it, make them pay a biosecurity tax to prop up the not-so-good products coming in from overseas by their competitors? I mean, it just makes no sense. That is why I can't understand why there are very few, if any, speakers from the Labor side. Appreciating that the member for Moreton was on the list I saw, and good on him for speaking. He speaks on most pieces of legislation. I can't understand why, when we are in a cost of living crisis, why every Labor member isn't speaking on this bill, particularly every Labor regional member should be defending what they're doing, should be explaining what this bill is all about. Because, you know, the essence of this bill will mean that consumers will pay more at the grocery checkout. They'll pay more for their food. They'll pay more for their vegetables. They'll pay more whether it's imported food or whether it's home, fresh produce. And to a degree, I don't really care that Paraguayan pawpaws, I'm not sure even if they grow pawpaws in Paraguay, but possibly they do. I'm told by the member for Grey he would know. Another good farmer, another very, very good member from a farming electorate. I don't really care whether some of those products that we get in, Portugal pears or whatever the case might be, whether they are going to be more expensive than what we produce here in Australia. Because what I want to see is our farmers not only being able to compete fairly with the supermarkets and the duopolies prices that they give them, because farmers, let's face it, are price takers, not price makers. But I want to see our farmers treated fairly when it comes to the prices paid at the grocery store, and I don't want to see our farmers unnecessarily slugged because they have to pay for the biosecurity charges to assist their competitors from countries that, quite frankly, many Australians would not even be able to pronounce. And I say that with all due respect, because often you have to look at a label to see, in fact, where the product comes from. And many of the products we are getting in from overseas, and I know there's a lot of WTO arrangements put in place, but gee whiz, I've seen too many cases of dumping over the years to know that our farmers are up against it. They are up against it. And I know the WTO rules prevail, and I know there's been a lot of cases brought, but our farmers shouldn't have to be treated unfairly by our government, their government, the government that is bringing in these new biosecurity taxes on my people, on the member for O'Connor's people, on the member for Grey's people. And it matters not that to Labor that our farmers are going to have to pay for this, and that more so is a sad aspect of this whole unnecessary, ill-thought, ill-conceived legislation. But don't take my word for it. Barry Large from Grain Producers Australia, he's encouraging all members of parliament, especially crossbench senators, to carefully consider the report that's been produced, the findings of that report, and to talk with producers actually impacted by this bad policy. They're his words, actually impacted by this bad policy. And here's the challenge to Labor members opposite. Start talking to your constituents, particularly if you are in a regional area. But more importantly, Speaker, don't just talk to them, listen to them, because I think what we're seeing is far too many regional Labor members, and thankfully there aren't too many of them, but for those of them who are in this place, I urge and encourage them to listen to their producers, whether they're producing small volumes or large, but particularly listen to them. Now, Mr Large had this to say: producers across all farm commodities have provided a strong and unified voice against this proposal, given we already pay enough in levies to fund multiple public good outcomes, including environmental benefits and increased taxation generation for the nation. The member for Ryan talked about the environment coming first, and I don't necessarily disagree with her in that regard, but let's put people first. Let's put people at the heart of this. Yes, the environment's important. The best stewards of our environment are who? Our farmers. The member for Grey knows. Are our farmers, because without good soils, without sustainable rivers, they wouldn't be able to grow the food that is the finest in the world, that is now going to have to compete unfairly with overseas interests. It's unpalatable, and we really believe it should be scrapped, Mr Large continued. A good consultation period in the beginning would have saved us all a lot of grief. And haven't we heard that over and over and over again? Ad nauseum, the fact that Labor doesn't consult as it should, that it rushes through this ill-thought policy. Australian producers take biosecurity seriously on our farms every single day. That's why we already pay significant amounts to fund biosecurity protections directly within our own businesses. Mr Large again. And he's right. He's right. And he added that we also pay directly through other compulsory industry levies that raise hundreds of millions of dollars, including biosecurity levies. And here's the rub. Because whatever amount of money this raises to pay for, Labor says, biosecurity now, Labor, knowing how it loves taxes, it loves new taxes, Labor will use this as a cash cow. This is the thin edge of the wedge, because when Labor sees that this works and raises a few $10 million here, a few $10 million there, they'll say, well, the farmers are they're pretty easy to touch up. We'll whack them more. Why not? They make plenty of money. They make plenty of money. That's what Labor thinks. Our farmers work so hard, and during COVID, along with our miners, kept this nation going. Make no mistake, they kept this nation fed. They kept other nations fed besides. They kept our exports up, as did our miners, and our health professionals saved people's lives. Yet we hear over and again the Treasurer saying, oh, what have we got to show for $1 trillion of Liberal Party debt? Well, it wasn't just the Liberal Party, it was the National Party as well. But there's not $1 trillion. There's not $1 trillion. There's nowhere near $1 trillion, and it should be absolutely every time he says it, and absolutely every time Labor gets their talking points and just reads directly from them because they can't ever think for themselves, it should be disparaged. It should be disparaged. David Jahinki, National Farmers Federation President. We call on senators to see common sense and hit pause on this legislation so they can listen carefully to the criticism this flawed policy has drawn, he said. It's not just Australia's 85,000 farmers who have raised alarm bells, it's also the Productivity Commission, the Australian National University, the Office of Impact Analysis, and even importers. That's what he said. He called on senators. I call on members. Why doesn't the Labor Whip's office phone start ringing hot with Labor members wanting to speak on this bill? Why isn't there a long list of Labor members? The member for Crangamite's just about to walk in, and I welcome her. I hope she's going to start the flood of Labor members of Parliament to come in and speak about this important bill and to defend it. And to defend it passionately, because at the moment there is no defence of this bill. There is absolutely no defence of this bill, because it's bad policy. And it's not just me saying it, it's the NFF President, it's the Grain Producers Chairman, it's Michael Gearan, the Ag Force Queensland CEO, who says, and I quote, "Let there be no doubt this biosecurity levy is a tax in thinly veiled disguise, and farmers resent being blindsided in this way." My father wasn't a protester. He was a good, hard-working sheep wheat farmer. He didn't like meetings. He once gave me the advice, don't get on too many committees because you'll have to turn up to too many meetings. I really listened to him in that regard, didn't I? That said, I like to think that I do my bit for farmers by being a political representative. But that said, he did turn up to the big rally outside this place when Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister. And, you know, Bob Hawke actually listened. He didn't do what the farmers wanted, but he actually listened. And that is what a good government, a good Prime Minister does. I hope that Labor starts to listen. Not just bring in these flawed policies, not just bring in this ill-conceived legislation at a time of a cost of living crisis, at a time when people are already paying way too much at the supermarket checkout, when people are hurting, when food banks are getting people who would never have presented themselves, never have gone to the Salvos, never have gone to St Vinny's, and are turning up to get food hampers because they can't afford it. And what are we going to do? We're going to slug our farmers unfairly. We're going to cripple them with even more taxes that they can ill afford and they can't pay. And for what outcome? Nothing. A typical Labor policy which does nothing to help our good country folk, those people who don't mind getting dirt under their fingernails to grow the food and fibre that props this nation up, that helps support this nation, that feeds and clothes this nation and many more besides. I say to Labor members, get off your backsides, Get out into your regional communities, start listening to the farmers, start listening to the people who make a difference in this country.
And I thank the member for Riverina. The question before the House is that the amendment be agreed to, and I give the call to the